To Love a Dragon. Written and narrated by the Hangman. Starring Schaefer Bates, Jet Set Sound, P.G. Bailey, Felix H., and Luke Dact. Chapter 1. Park kept quiet. The morning fog still filled the forest, and his vision was not as good as theirs. He would have to rely on his stealth and wits alone if he were to make it through the trees undetected. He had to leave his horse behind as well. He thought at times of ditching his armor to make less noise as he crept through the forest, but he knew that would be unwise should he be discovered. His heart raced. Park knew he was close. With every step, his breath deepened, his heart sped faster and faster, his brow perspired more profusely, and his eyes darted in every direction. He would have to calm himself, or he would faint before he arrived. With one stroke of his arm, he slowly parted a bush and sawed down into an empty clearing in the wood. With only a few boulders covered in moss, the clearing was empty. Park knew he would have to wait. For her. An hour passed. Park has managed to calm his nerves while he sat. His eyes remained focused down into the clearing, but his mind was elsewhere. He thought of his mark. He had seen her so many times before and was determined to do so again. She was not like any of the others he had fought before. No, she was different. Since the war was declared by his king on the race of dragons, he had fought many great warriors of their proud race. But she was different. She was swift, agile, and deadly. One of the deadliest he had ever seen. Park thought to a year ago. He was with a squad of his men on the way back to the castle to report to the king. It was then a group of dragons ambushed. He had become separated from the rest of the men during the assault. During the confusion, he found himself in a clearing, alone and outnumbered. He had only to wait for the dragons to come. There was no more need to run. It was here he would make his stand. With his sword drawn, he heard the rapid footsteps against the dry leaves. He looked around for a place to surprise his upcoming attacker, but found none. He would face death head on. Overhead, he saw the figure of his assassin spring out from the bush down into the clearing below. She was garbed in the traditional clothing of dragons, but a bit different from the rest. There was no ordinary foot soldier. No, she was an elite dragoness. He looked upon her as she was crouched from her landing into the small valley below where he waited. In one instance, she looked up and directly into his eyes. He gasped slightly as she peered into his very soul. He saw oblivion in a shade of green, Beelzebub himself dressed in horns and a tail, and as if she could read his thoughts, she smiled menacingly at him. He almost fell back at the sight of this.
I wouldn't try to run, human. You know you cannot escape me.
It was true. The dragons were twice as fast as humans, and 3 times on all fours. They were stronger too. One-on-one, a dragon could easily defeat a man in combat. There were even stories of the dragon whelps killing full-grown warriors. Humans have had to change tactics during the war so as to actually stand a chance. But Park would not be able to rely on that now. He was alone with only his sword in his hands. Park was an accomplished knight, though. He had fought bravely for many battles and proved himself to be one of the greatest warriors in the kingdom. His eyes narrowed, and he gritted his teeth. If death itself were here to take him to hell, then this bitch was going to have to come and get him. The dragoness stood up to face him. She was no taller than he was, not counting her horns anyway. From head to tail, she was covered in scales. She wore a brown strapless tight leather skirted outfit and a large necklace with an emerald in the center. The dragons used no weapons of steel. Their only weapons were feet and hands armed with black claws and an 8-foot tail that was capable of wrapping around and grabbing things.
Like your neck.
She hissed. He growled at her. He had almost forgotten the females were capable of reading the minds of humans.
It won't be an easy task, devil. You might get my neck, but it will cost you your head.
She dropped her head slightly and gazed up at him, smiling her menace to him again. He almost hated thinking it. But her eyes were one feature that she had that didn't stalk him in his nightmares. No, her eyes would be something of his dreams. They were deep and penetrating with a slight yellow tint. Her face and muzzle were not scaled like the rest of her body. They were smooth and inviting. His eyes widened as they crept down her neck, examining her features. The contours of her body were flawless. He examined her torso. Her breasts were so very supple. He became lost in her body. With every inch he looked upon, he became more entranced. So much that he didn't even notice the first attack. He screamed as he was struck in the side of his helmet. She had seen him looking up and down her body and decided to teach this man a lesson about respecting a dragoness, or at least paying attention when you're about to be killed by one. The swipe from her clawed hand sent him flying against the side of a boulder. If not for the helmet, he'd surely be dead. Amused, the dragoness slowly paced around the edge of the clearing, waiting for him to get up. His head ached from the blow, and his back pained from the impact. His thoughts quickly returned to the battle, and how he may wind up dead. After that attack, he thought that it may come quicker than intended. Using his sword to stable himself, he made it to his feet. He yanked the helmet off and threw it to the ground. Due to the large dragoness hand dent in it, the helmet had been squeezing his head much too tightly.
You vile temptress! You will not be able to catch me off guard again with your charms, with your lustful eyes, smooth face and cheeks, your perfectly sculpted backside, the way your tail sways back and forth as you walk, and your life-giving breasts, so round, perky and... Hey!
The dragoness erupted in laughter at the knight drooling at her. He was enraged now at the contempt.
Stop that at once! I will not be made a fool!
He screamed. And with that said, he ran and jumped to her. His sword directly held behind over his head. He aimed to cut her in two with one massive stroke. His sword came down to the ground, splitting a boulder into two separate pieces, then exploding into dust and gravel. His eyes widened in shock. Did he get her? Park peered from the corner of his eyes and saw the dragoness standing to his left. Immediately he jumped to strike again. He slashed again and again, hitting only air. He didn't even see her move, only that she wasn't there when he finished his attack.
Too slow, human.
He spun around to face her. He only began to realize she was toying with him from the beginning. He stared in shock as she stood there smirking at him. Ye gods, she was fast, faster than anything he had ever seen before. She dropped her head, crouched slightly, and narrowed her eyes.
My turn.
She hissed. He raised his sword to prepare for the oncoming attack.
This one may be it,
he thought. Park was already winded, yet the battle had just begun. The dragoness raised her arm ready to strike. With her claws shining in the sunlight, she raced toward him. But he was ready this time. With his sword raised, he swung to greet her with cold steel before she was able to reach him. She saw the counterattack coming and grabbed the sword before it could reach her neck. Mere inches away, they looked into each other's eyes as the two struggled against one another. He pushed all of his might into the hilt of the sword, hoping to at least cause some damage. With some effort, she held the sword at bay, both feeling it start to crack. Her hide was tough, but his blade was still sharp. Blood ran from her hand down to the hilt, trickling down his hand onto the ground. With one last mighty crack, the dragoness snapped the sword, sending shards every which direction. She threw the broken steel behind her and delivered a mighty kick to his chest, sending him off his feet. Park hit the ground with a thud. He sputtered and coughed up blood. He held what remained of his sword in his hands as a last defense to his approaching death. She walked toward him with her hands on her hips, eyes gazing evilly into his.
It will be a shame to kill one so handsome and who fought so valiantly,
she said.
Save it.
He growled. He raised the last remaining piece of his sword behind his head, intending on throwing the sword from him. And with the second whip, she sent it flying into the woods above. Nothing left. At least he found comfort in knowing at least he was to die by the hands of such a skilled and beautiful warrior like her. It would be a glorious death. She approached and stood over him.
Any last words, human?
He glared up at her. The dragoness dropped down, straddling him. She pinned his shoulders down with her hands.
Speak up, human.
She was so close to his face now that he could feel her breath against his cheek as she spoke into his ear. She opened her mouth and flicked her forked tongue out. She licked around the edge of his ear. This strangely aroused Park, but it was only cruel punishment now, as his life was about to end. The dragoness brought her eyes back up and peered into his and his soul once more. Park knowing she was about to extinguish it.
Do your...
Park was frozen, unable to move, let alone think. Shock was not a word to describe what he felt just then. He was confused, confounded, and befuddled. Everything, for he was not dead. No, what he felt was not a dragon's claws tearing out his throat, nor was it the cold taste of steel penetrating his heart. It was something else. The dragoness was kissing him. His eyes shot open. He stared at her in horror. His thoughts ran into each other like the fools the king employs for a good laugh. His very soul screamed to run out of his own body and get away. He screamed into the realm of his own mind.
By the gods, what is she doing?
The dragoness felt somewhat differently about the ordeal. She broke away from his lips for only a moment.
It's called a kiss, human. Doesn't your kind do it too?
Park frantically answered back.
Yes, we do, but not with a...
Once more he was silenced by her kiss, but she was deeper this time. The kiss was harder. She slid her forked tongue into Park's mouth and explored his. There was nothing he could do. She was much too powerful to struggle against. But why struggle, he thought. The dragoness lifted up once more and looked at Park. He didn't even see the same ferocity or deadly determination as before. She looked tenderly into his eyes. Park lied motionless, not knowing what to expect next. Was this a game she would play with her victims before she killed them? Perhaps the dragons were more sinister than he thought, toying with their kill before sending them to the afterlife.
Are you going to kill me now, dragon?
No, I think not, human. I've had my fun,
she replied as she stood up. The dragoness turned away from him. Her tail rubbed against the side of his face, caressing his cheek. Park sat up and watched the dragoness walk away, swaying her hips with each step. She looked back to him once more.
Perhaps we shall meet again one day, Park.
And with one lightning-quick jump, she was gone. Park held his hand to his cheek where her tail rubbed. He sat there for what seemed like an eternity. No words or thoughts came to him. Nothing could describe what happened. Outmatched in a battle against an elite dragoness, and he survived. In a day where he should surely be dead, instead kissed by death itself. Her eyes that looked into his, he could never forget. and he would never forget her.